All right, hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Miro Consulting webinar on the 10 most common technology and usage changes that cause Oracle compliance issues. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP of Marketing and Lead Salesforce Analyst here at Miro Consulting. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Presenting today will be Tim Hegdes, Director of Technical Services and Microsoft Practice Leader at Miro Consulting. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will answer them at the end of the session. We won't say your name or who's asking the question, but we will read the question aloud to the audience. If you have any questions that you'd like a private consultation on, feel free to contact us after the event. Before I begin, I just want to quickly explain who Miro is. Miro Consulting is the leading global provider of software asset management and subscription management services for Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, and Salesforce. We specialize in license management, audit advisory and audit defense, negotiation tactics, support management, and cloud services. And our mission is to help our clients maximize their ROI on software license and subscription investments, stay in compliance, and negotiate successful contracts and audit settlements. And before I turn it over to Tim, one of the most common things we get quite often is people say to us, "Hey, well, everything's fine. I haven't made any changes to my environment. So I was compliant before, so I must still be compliant." Well, unfortunately, that often is not the case. The software vendors will change rules, reinterpret their rules differently. All kinds of things like that will change over time. So even if you never change your environment, the rules could change without you knowing about it. So it's really important to never assume that you will be okay just because you were okay before. But with that, to get into the details of the things that we find are the most common causes, Tim, can you start the presentation?
Thank you, Sean, and welcome to everyone on this beautiful day, at least in the northeast of the United States. Promise that it won't be. The promise is that it won't stay that way forever. So we're getting a taste of summer on this fall afternoon. Right. So rather than an agenda, which is really what the name of this webinar is, we'll launch right into it. First, though, a summary kind of supporting what Sean had just said. And even if you don't change the software, you could still run afoul of Oracle's license compliance rules. You might, for example, change the hardware platform, or you could have some older metrics. But even if you don't make those changes, you could still be out of compliance. And why is this, right? And it's a great question. Because IT technologies are constantly evolving. And around them, the licensing evolves. Now, Oracle can be a little bit vaguer than others when it comes to licensing, but be assured that if Oracle wants to audit your firm, which is its right to do, you could end up being non-compliant. But there's also something more insidious. I mentioned that Oracle's licensing rules are not terribly clear, but they are also go somewhat unannounced. So an update to, say, Database Standard Edition from release 12.1.0.1 to 12.1.0.2 automatically, and I'm stressing that, automatically makes the release Database Standard Edition 2, right, which brings with it some new licensing constraints. So we will discuss how these changes, just 10 of them, and be aware that there are many more, could affect your license compliance position. We're going to illustrate all of these changes using the fictional company called ABC, right? And the very first compliance challenge is shifting to the cloud. Now, regardless of your current stance on cloud deployments, it is hard to argue that cloud is an unknown entity. And whether your organization has adopted a cloud-first policy or a cloud last policy, that is, you are not considering any transitions to the cloud, or are somewhere in between those 2 points, it is important to realize and understand that all clouds are not created equal, and Oracle doesn't treat them all equally. And it is just as important to understand that technology or the hardware in use by the cloud provider will not be the same as what you have on premises. So in this case, a one-for-one or a lift and shift, how many of you have heard that term, right? May introduce a compliance issue. And this is because the core factor does not apply to what Oracle refers to as authorized cloud environments, which currently include only AWS and Azure. So a one-for-one approach would leave you with half of the required licenses. But there's good news afoot, right? First, such a move provides your organization with the opportunity to fit the deployment more properly. That is, to right-size it. Secondly, the servers in use at the cloud provider are bigger and stronger and faster than what you have on premise, and they likely always will be. So CPU intensive applications, for example, would be unconstrained by the additional compute cycles. So now we have ABC Corporation, those poor people, taking a page out of the virtualization book, and rightly so, right? Because virtualization has become the de facto norm for companies both large and small. The problem? Oracle doesn't treat software partitioning as a quote-unquote permitted means to determine or limit the number of software licenses required for any given server or cluster of servers. That's a direct quote from the Oracle partitioning policy. Now, it's important to note that while we're picking on VMware, often called the Cadillac of virtualization solutions, it is really all software partitioning methodologies that are subject to this rule, right? So we're going to say VMware, but we mean all of the solutions, all of the software solutions. So ABC went and purchased VMware and implemented it as a best practice, and good for them, right? Or is it? What Oracle has in the past is adopt that control outside of VMware is necessary. And this control outside of VMware through segregation via the storage subsystem or the network or the VLAN, if you will. But this could run counter to the configuration often suggested by VMware or other virtualization experts. In other words, the company must segregate their environment in an appropriate manner or risk having to license the entire vCenter.
And quickly jump in and just quickly mention, this is one of the biggest screw-ups, for lack of a better term, that we find organizations doing, because a lot of times they'll install something thinking, hey, I'm only using 10% of this system's capabilities. That's all I need to have license for. And they set it up wrong. And when they get audited, they find out that now they got to pay for the whole thing. And that can be, we've seen it run into the millions of dollars. So I would say double, triple check how you have your segmentation done in virtualization, because there are many, many ways to get it wrong. And it can be one of the most devastating in terms of audit findings. So again, if you have any questions on the right way to do that, feel free to contact us.
Thank you for that, Sean. So we're getting more and more sophisticated, right? Or ABC is, right? In this challenge or change, the company of ABC has expanded its use of Oracle e-business application by using an API or application programming interface. The use of an API is relatively common. What's really uncommon is understanding how this may impact licensing, and it does. The distinction is benefiting from the use of the EBS application. And while employees do not directly access the application via distinct accounts, they may do so indirectly. So this in turn would increase the user count of the application. So as an example, if there were just 4 users of this application, the company would have required 4 licenses, right? Makes sense. However, now that they have introduced an API with a generic user account, they require more licenses. And by the way, a very similar issue will be presented later on. But back to generic user accounts, it's a fact that the generic user account really doesn't matter because as Oracle states, and this is a quote directly from its EBS price list, if multiplexing hardware or software is used, this number must be measured at the multiplexing front end, right? So that is the definition of multiplexing, how multiplexing is used. And the inherent database, right? Well, that is better off being licensed by processor rather than by users or what are referred to as named user plus. So now ABC, for the first time, has expanded into selling the products themselves, or possibly in addition to selling their products through channels, right? In any event, Oracle does not treat these licenses the same. In Oracle's technology price list, it states that the licenses are for your internal users, right? Customer of ABC wouldn't qualify. And so this introduces the concept of proprietary hosting. Now, we can easily eat up an entire webinar on proprietary hosting and how Miro might help you through the forms, the manner in which the environment would be segregated, and so on. Suffice it to say that there is a lot to this issue of proprietary hosting. But let's also agree that we've covered these bases for ABC Corporation, right? And they would have to have purchased additional licenses for this externally accessed application because they have different constraints on them. Chiefly, that they can only be used for the application in question. That is, that they cannot be used internally.
I should quickly note there, that's one of the things that's changed recently. So some of the rules on prop hosting is the perfect example of Oracle viewed it one way for a while, and all of a sudden they've recently changed their definition of it. So that's, again, even if you don't do anything different, Oracle might decide to look at things a little differently, and it might cause a problem for you.
Exactly. So challenge number 5 is changing a server platform, and going hand in hand sort of with the previous discussion is the idea of reconfiguring the servers to handle additional workload. Now, if it weren't for the externally accessed applications, ABC would want to minimize that environment, right? And consequently that investment. Well, there's no shortage of hardware vendors, and perhaps a particular vendor has made you an offer that's too good to be true, truly irresistible. An offer you can't turn down, however you want to say it. And that's what happened here. And instead of enjoying a 0.5 core factor on their Intel-based servers, they believed that the IBM Power 10 servers were better suited, and they might be. But one thing about the IBM Power 10 servers is that Oracle treats them with a 1.0 core factor. That's double the software investment. So now that deal on the hardware wasn't so good after all. Hardware in general, and servers more specifically, have become something of a commodity. And they could cost less. In fact, they often cost less than the software that resides on them. And if you're thinking these servers could always be used internally, well, I would say think again, because that 1.4 core hosting or core factor applies regardless of whether or not proprietary hosting is in place or not. Now, here's an insidious aspect of software licensing, and it's not an Oracle upgrade, though that has its own connotations, right? In this situation, you have the company ABC upgrading VMware from version 5.x to version 7.x. And this has introduced a whole new wrinkle, right? Whoa, right? So, namely, that is, this upgrade, that VMware can be used to mitigate the control of a virtual instance between vCenters. That is, from one vCenter to another. That's cool, right? Well, it's not so cool in Oracle's mind. And that because that feature extends to Oracle licensing all the vCenters, every host in every cluster in the shop. And it doesn't matter what sort of VMware controls or policies or logs are in place. Oracle wants to be able to control where its products are running. So the segregation by storage subsystem, which I mentioned previously, is insufficient. Oracle also calls for segregation by network or by VLAN. And note that that control is outside the control of VMware. That's right where Oracle wants it. Now, this could be altered again in the future if and when Oracle, or VMware rather, or its cohorts introduce new functionality into their programs. But at this time, it is the Oracle rule. And while this Oracle rule may be contrary to the spirit of virtualization, it is still Oracle's rule. And by the way, this segregation concept works similarly with all technology products, Oracle technology products. That includes Java. So you might want to investigate some further segregation. With having reached a level of sophistication and having deployed some proprietary hosting applications, ABC Company has now decided to implement a disaster recovery protocol. Okay? We could do, and literally we have done, another whole webinar on DR because the complexity of the Oracle rules around DR would call for that. But despite the seemingly strangeness of its rules, the subject of DR licensing is not unique to Oracle. So this situation is pretty straightforward. ABC had been copying its production environment to their DR servers on a nightly basis. But since time immemorial, there hasn't been a single instance of these DR servers ever being required. Knock wood, right? This, of course, excluded the periodic tests that ABC would run, but since these tests never exceeded the 10 days per calendar year, no licensing was necessary for those servers. However, and there's always however, the new applications brought with them a new recovery time objective, or RTO for you diehards out there. That is part of the service level agreement, or SLA, and this prompted new DR services that manifest itself in additional licensing. Difference between Oracle's definition of failover and standby is in fact this, right? In the case of the former, no licensing is required, subject to the limitations, while licensing is always required for the latter. So when you have a failover environment, to put it this simply, if you follow Oracle's rules, there would be no reason to license it. However, outside of those rules, if those rules cannot exist or those rules would be broken, licensing is always required.
And I should also mention that this is also one of the biggest problems we encounter when clients first come to Miro. We would say that 80% of them or so believe they have a failover environment that does not need to be licensed. And in fact, they actually have what counts as standby. It is one of the most common things. And second, I just want to also mention a lot of our clients, disaster recovery, and they're either failover or standby, is one of the most common things we see them moving to the cloud. To put it as one of our prospects put it, if our main data center gets taken out by a hurricane, we don't want our disaster recovery center also taken out by the same hurricane. So we often find that our clients are taking advantage of that by moving. It's very easy to select the cloud server very far away or region and put your disaster recovery there. And then they trip over one of the rules we mentioned earlier about how many of the core factor changes, and they don't realize that. So again, disaster recovery is one of those areas that can put you out of compliance in a couple of different ways. So again, if we can very quickly help you out, find out if you've got your system set up correctly, so you can have that peace of mind. Tim?
Thank you, Sean. And he's absolutely right. Proprietary hosting and disaster recovery are two, or virtualization and disaster recovery are two of the areas in which we excel and which we often find that there are compliance issues. Moving on to change number 8. In this case, ABC Corporation wanted to implement some more efficiency to their business by automating some of their manual processes. And so they did. Right? They implemented an unattended process in place of a human-involved job, and this worked out just fine, except for the licensing. You see, since the licensing had been by user, that is, with the named user plus or NUP metric, that was no longer sufficient. So in order to accommodate this automated process or processes, as the case may be, there would be an uncountability, if that's a word, aspect to this application, and that is ample justification for licensing in the processor metric. Now, this is a little slippery in that Oracle does not always enforce this, but the one thing they do look at is whether the data is accessed outside the company, and this not for proprietary hosting reasons, but rather access to the data, often aggregated data. And it is very, very rare in this day and age that your data, or at least some of it, is accessed only internally. And certainly Oracle doesn't believe that would be true. You might recall that earlier in our discussion, it was around APIs. it was mentioned that a very similar issue will be presented. Well, this is it. And now, having a single person doing a task is terrible business. It's bad business. And as ABC grew, it recognized this, right? So it assigned multiple persons to perform a task utilizing the very same credentials. And since auditing was also a concern, they elected to use a generic user account, right? Problem. Since Oracle insists that multiplexing users, which is the case whenever a generic user account is used, that the number of unique users must be measured at the multiplexing front end. Again, that's a direct quote from the Oracle price list. So in this case, there were 4 unique users assigned to this task, meaning that 4 licenses needed to be allocated, and ABC only had 1. So by this time, some of ABC's applications had grown so large, demanded so much time from their internal employees, they decided to outsource them. Right? To be clear now, this outsourcing was not to AWS or to Azure or to any of the other hosting service providers. This was clearly the business end of the application that required a third party to handle it. So when ABC decided to take this step, they were also required to obtain new licenses because the existing licenses, which could then be repurposed, had the traditional constraint of only being used or could only have been used internally. And that speaks to the vagueness that Oracle often applies to its licensing rules. For example, the definition for processor licenses includes programs licensed on a processor basis may be accessed by your internal users, including agents and contractors, and by your third-party users. So from that language, you could easily interpret that to mean that access by the third-party users would be licensed. But Oracle, who owns the IP, can argue that this third party does not meet its requirements. So the interpretation of this rule is the distinction. So with that, I will turn this back over to Sean.
All right, thanks, Tim. We have time for at least one question here, I think. Okay, here's the question. If we've gone through the work to segment our Oracle database from our compute network storage, does Oracle have to certify for that to be compliant, or is it only determinable through an audit?
The answer would be that if you are not asked that question, you don't answer that question. So that would speak to the latter. However, of late, Oracle has in fact required some level of certification, and I'm doing air quotes here, certification for the tools in use or the processes in use as a result of an audit.
And I could mention, if you've got general questions like that and you're kind of afraid to ask Oracle, hey, am I out of compliance? Because they might come back and say, yes, in fact, you are, and you owe us a lot of money. If you were planning on something and looking at an architecture and you want to know, do your plans, would they be compliant with licensing? The best thing to do is to get an independent review, what we would call a friendly audit, where someone could come in, look at that, and determine and say, okay, if you want to do this, this is what you'd have to do it with compliance, or you'd have to make these changes. So, you can go to an independent third party like Miro or another organization like ours, and we can help you understand what the situation is. And with that, I have one or two other questions here, but they're a little, the way they're being asked, I'm a little concerned that they might de-anonymize you because of the specifics of the question. So we're going to get back to you after the webinar, and we will follow up and get someone to give you an answer on those. And with that, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Tim. Have a great day.